And over 25 years, as you can imagine, we've gone through a lot of different programs and processes in order to make workers feel empowered. So we've attempted an ESOP, and we'll talk about that, I guess, a little bit later. And now we're doing really what is called a profit sharing program predicated on a contract. And the contract that we write is really around accountability and responsibility. And because we're production people, we make things for a living, we call it swear. And so swear is something that we take an oath to, management and employees sign, and it's really around what we've got to bring to the table for our business in terms of safety, waste, efficiency, attendance, and returns, which is quality. And if we swear to go do our level best to meet our customers' expectations, we actually have provided less than college graduate employees, on average, $50,000 jobs for the last 25 years.
Thank you for that overview. So next, Steve, another model, worker co-op. You ran and built the largest in the country. So tell us about how that works, and so what you learned about creating good jobs through that model.
Sure. So, hello everybody. Thanks for braving the weather. I represent here a couple of organizations, but particularly Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is a worker-owned company based in the Bronx, started as a welfare to work program about 27 years ago. Provides home health care services to low-income people in the Bronx and in Manhattan. Started with 12 home care workers and now employ 2,300. We have our own, it's mostly a Latina and African-American female workforce. These are the home health aides who, if you have a loved one who's ill or living at home, and rather than going in a nursing home, someone comes in, helps with bathing and feeding and support for your loved one. This is typically described as certainly as a low-wage job, but it's a very high-skilled job. It requires enormous amounts of skills to be able to care well for an elderly person or a person with physical disabilities. There are very few training requirements for this type of worker. Federally, is only 75 hours of training. And so when we built the company, we wanted to make it a very employee-centered organization. That's why we designed it as a worker-owned company to begin with. We created our own employer-based training program, so now we train 600 women a year, guarantee them employment if they graduate from the training program. We double the number of hours required, and so our outcomes in terms of from a workforce development perspective is very, very high. We have the typical turnover in the industry of home care is around 50% annually. Ours is below 20% all the time. We have an excellent graduation and placement because we're training for ourselves. A worker-owned company, worker cooperative rather, just really quickly, is simply a for-profit business where the employees are the owners of the business. It's typically structured as a democratic governance so that the employees have one share, one vote. They have the right to elect their board of directors and also share in the dividends. So that's the basic design of a worker cooperative. These models are not necessarily incompatible. Cooperative Home Care is also a B corporation, as is its sister cooperative in Philadelphia, Home Care Associates. In fact, B Corp named 18 of the best for the world B Corps of all their 600 plus members, and both Cooperative Home Care Associates and Home Care Associates in Philadelphia were among those top 18. So we are proudly part of that movement as well. And it's a nice way to underscore that we're not the only ones who say we're great. They they come in and do a very serious audit, social audit and organizational audit of workplace and environmental and community outcomes, and the fact that we are designed to around both our workers and our consumers is why I think we scored so high. The only final thing I'll say is I hope we will soon talk about the fact that worker cooperatives are seen by many in the philanthropic and public world as perhaps a way to generate economic development, community development in low-income communities. That's certainly where we started. There's probably, however, only about 300 worker cooperatives in the country right now, so it's still a very small movement, growing, but relatively small. And since it's relatively small, and since the problem is so large of unemployment and the resources are so precious, we've always focused on trying to make sure that we are not simply trying to build a good company, although that's really important, and the fact that we've been able to, similarly to what Albert was saying, provide a degree of stability for low-income women, for thousands of low-income women now, in a company, in a community that's very unstable, that we're very, very proud of, but 2,300 workers, even in the Bronx, is not a very big number. So any strategy that invests in worker ownership or some type of capital democratization needs to not stop with just the enterprise, but also figure out how to leverage what we learn within that enterprise to impact and influence the larger industry. So much of what my organization does, which is PHI, which is a nonprofit associated with Cooperative Home Care, we are the development arm of that cooperative, but we then take the learnings from that cooperative and work with many, many other conventionally owned businesses and nonprofits to take the practices that we've learned and improve them in other agencies, but also, since this industry is so regulated by the public, so many public dollars go into these businesses, we have a great deal of work in the public policy arena to improve regulations and reimbursement policies to improve the quality of jobs for the whole sector, not just a single enterprise.
So all coming there, so much getting ahead of us. But thank you. And Camille keeps track of all kinds of employee ownership. So please situate us and tell us where we are in terms of employee stock ownership programs or sort of the other things you watch. Are a lot of them now? Not very many. Where are we?
So I'm with the National Center for Employee Ownership. I'm the research director there, and we do. There's people who can talk about this topic a lot better than me. Norman Curlin, for example, is in the room, and he's been working on these issues for a very long time. But we work on all forms of employee ownership, including cooperatives and different types of synthetic equity. But we primarily focus on ESOPs. It's an employee stock ownership plan, and it's the most common form of employee ownership, broad-based employee ownership in the country. And when I'm saying broad-based, I mean it doesn't just apply to management or executives or a few people at the top. It applies to most or all of the employees in the company. There's currently around 10,000 ESOPs or ESOP-like plans in the United States, covering around 13 million employees. So while cooperatives have governance structures that make them a very deep impact, ESOPs can work in more traditional companies and are a little bit more scalable, at least in the US, and have been able to be a larger part of the US economy. And while I think the idea of employee ownership is really intuitive, like we all think, oh yeah, employees should own the business, they should be part of the financial participation, the wealth of their firm. The idea of an ESOP can be, in particular, this one vehicle for employee ownership can be a little bit confusing. So I kind of want to give you a background. I think the history of employee ownership and ESOPs particularly helps clarify what this form of employee ownership is. And the first one started in 1956 with Peninsula Newspapers. A man named Louis Kelso invented the ESOP. And what he thought, his idea was that ownership now, capitalism has an issue, and it concentrates ownership. It's a concept that we're all familiar with, that capitalism has this problem. And his solution was that we need broader ownership. We need more capitalists. We need more people who are participating in capital ownership in this nation. So what his solution was, there was this newspaper, and the owner wanted to sell to employees, but employees don't have millions of dollars to buy out a company, especially in certain industries. It's very difficult to raise the capital. Banks often won't give individual employees the capital to buy a company out. So he created this structure by which the company could create a trust, and the trust could buy all the shares, which would be held on behalf of employees, and pay back the loan with pre-tax company profits. And they used actually a profit sharing plan. That was all that was in place at the time. There were no ESOPs at the federal level at the time. So he used a profit sharing plan to build this trust and get a loan on behalf of this trust, which held the shares for employees. And then as the company continued to succeed, continued to be profitable, they could pay it back, and eventually employees would own the entire company without having to put in a dime of their own money. So that's how this idea started, is with him. He had a boutique law firm, and he would set them up around the country. But he had a friend, Russell Long, who was a senator, and he was in the finance committee of the Senate, and he was known for his incredible knowledge of expertise in tax law, which we're all striving to understand. So, so he was at the time passing the Employee Retirement Income and Security Act, because before ERISA, which it's called before ERISA happened, companies would promise all these retirement benefits and then at the last minute just take them away. And there was no federal regulation for stopping them from doing that. So it was really important to have something that said, if you're going to promise all these, you don't have to give retirement benefits, but if you're going to promise all these benefits, you have to make sure you give them to employees. So Russell Long, Kelso got the ear of Russell Long, and they created this structure that Kelso had come up with and integrated into ERISA as another defined contribution retirement plan. So there's no necessary reason why employee ownership has to be a retirement plan, but historically, that's how it happened. So that's why employee ownership, that's why we often liken an employee-owned company to it's like a 401k plan, but it's employer stock, is because it got put through in that plan. But the larger issue is that it's financial participation for employees, helping them participate in the wealth that they're helping to create on a day-to-day basis with their labor. So that's kind of where we are now. ESOPs, because Kelso and Russell Long were able to do that, we have the most widely spread employee ownership in the US than in any other country. And I mean, there are countries that John Lewis Partnership in the UK you might be familiar with, or Mondragon in Spain, where they have cooperative or democratic models that have been very large, but those haven't scaled here. ESOPs have been the primary vehicle for employee ownership in the US. So that's kind of the employee ownership landscape, if you will.
Great. Wow, so I feel like we had some history lessons, and we also learned a lot about what's great about all of these models when they're successful. But it's not easy to make work, as I'm sure you all know. I guess I'd like to go to Jamie and ask about sort of in spreading the B Corp model, what challenges have you come up against in trying to sort of tell other people about it, or
well,
make it a bigger
I mean, the amazing thing is how quickly it's spread. There are now 19 states that have adopted benefit corporation legislation, allowing corporations to register that way, including in July, the governor of Delaware signed into law benefit corporation legislation. And actually, when I got to make my big speech on the floor about it, I said, we're going to be the Delaware of benefit corporations. We're going to attract all the progressive companies. And now Delaware is trying to be the Delaware of benefit corporations. You know, I think that there is, you know, a pervasive sense that something, that, you know, after the crash in 2008, that something had gone deeply wrong with the structure of the mega corporate economy, the too big to fail economy, and there've got to be ways to seed alternative efforts that give working people more of a stake and small business a chance in the economy. So I think that that's very much out there. You know, the risk for us is that it's assimilated and adopted so rapidly that it ends up not really meaning much, you know. But built into the benefit corporation laws are the requirement of filing reports that explain that you are adhering to the highest levels of environmental and workplace and social accountability and standards, you know, in terms of hiring and in terms of the environmental practices of the group. The public is becoming kind of a watchdog in terms of the activities of benefit corporations. So we don't want people saying they're a benefit corporation and not living up to it. I think that that's a big challenge there. But I like very much the idea that the benefit corporations are merging with these other models to develop a kind of counterculture within contemporary capitalism, that there's another way to go that's not just the big Wall Street companies.
And so Al, you've run your company for 25 years, and I imagine it's evolved a lot over that time. Like, what have you found that didn't work, you had to ditch, or things that you're testing out in terms of your model?
Well, over the course of 25 years, obviously, every day is a discovery of something new. So to give you an idea of trying to be a social entrepreneur, I like that word. I don't know where it came from, but I do like it. Trying to be a social entrepreneur. I'm gonna take you on a journey, and I'm gonna take you on a journey. It's gonna take me maybe 2 minutes to take you on this journey. And through this journey, if you really feel bad for me, just say "oh," okay? So we had a incredibly good 2007. We were in one of our plants. We were in ESOP. We made a lot of money. We had about $150 million in revenue. And all of our employees were doing very, very well on their Square incentive program. But we had about 150 employees, and I had a dream that number should be 500, and I had a way of doing it. I had always done our business at that time with large multinational paper companies who were headquartered in the United States. And during that time, I felt as though there was a new technology in Europe and Asia that had using recycled paper versus using tree-based paper that the United States companies, for their own reasons, didn't want to adopt, probably because they own the trees, right? So they own the trees. So I made this decision in 2007, 2008 to change the industry. Well, went in and figured out in order to change the industry, it was going to cost about $20 million to change the industry. Yeah. And I was having a difficult time, even though we were making money, getting financing, and I didn't know why in late 2007, but I found out in 2008. So I decided to do it with high cost debt and my own money. I put in $10 million, and the high cost debt put in $10 million, and we bought this wonderful German machine, and we bought and we took a ride. Well, fast forward, the whole situation collapsed in 2009. The debt we had, the financing we had dried up. The industry didn't change, and I had to bankrupt the company and take a wildly profitable business and put 150 employees on the street. Now that's worth a big hole right there, right? So obviously it was a personal failure. I made a lot of mistakes. A lot of people left me, up to and including my wife. There you go. There you go. I mean, you all right. So fast forward, rebuilding, new model, figure out a different way. So now we're running companies, we're getting on our feet, and I get a call from a former business partner, big company in Atlanta, who's looking for minority employees. And they said, well, hey, we know you had this business in New Jersey, and can you, any of those employees need a job? So what we did was we went back and we canvassed, trying to get and redirect all of the people that I felt like I had failed. And we came to find out that 90% were working, making more money than they were making when they were making with me. And so, well, that should have been a real big parade. And so the issue is in failure of really making a bad business decision, making a bad bet and losing. What I really wanted to do, which was permanently change lives, seems to have happened because those folks are doing perfectly well without me. So if the cost of that is $10 million, then I'm willing to pay that cost.
Huh. Wow, okay. That's not what I was expecting here, but quite a journey, so thank you on it. All right, so challenges to the business model. So Steve, though, I think you started to talk a little bit about worker co-ops have been around for a long time, right? But there's only 300 to 500 of them. We probably don't even know how many exactly. Why is it such a small? Why hasn't this model scaled if it has so many benefits? What are the obstacles there?
Well, I think, and Albert's story is indicative of this. I think that many people, particularly in the workforce development world, believe, and rightfully so, that it's quite easy to start a small business. It turns out it's extremely hard to keep it running and running profitably. So there's just in the small business general economy, you hear different statistics, but generally 4 out of 5 fail within the first 5 years. So if you have a public backing or philanthropic backing, there's an expectation that it shouldn't be too hard to create a business, and we'll just make it a cooperative, and everything it'll be a better business because it's a cooperative. And that's just not. There's just too much instability. There's too much risk to really have that as a strategy of trying to. If your challenge is to improve the quality of jobs for low-income people at some degree of scale, it's not going to happen business by business by business by business. So I think that there's been a recognition in the community development world, cooperative development world, that worker ownership is an incredibly important strategy where if you can establish a business that is stable and strong, then the worker ownership can really reinforce all that you're trying to do, because you're organized around the employee. There's a number of different practices that you can undertake, whether it's improving the quality of supervision that really is attended to how you supervise well a low-wage workforce. You can have peer mentor programs. You can link. You can have a program within the company for emergency loans. You can have a capacity within the organization to link people to public benefits, and particularly to earned income tax credit benefits. There's a number of different things that an employer can do to help take an unstable job and make it a stable job, and the worker ownership structure reinforces that. So if you have all the other elements of a successful business, then you can make an even better business from the perspective of the employee. It's the fact that it's just not so easy to create a business to begin with, or to keep it running. And in our industry as well, there's only so much any business can do given the constraints of public funding and public policy. So we felt in the Bronx that we were doing a very good job relatively to everybody else in terms of creating a stable employment for an unstable community, but that we couldn't do any better with the current rules, so we had to change the rules of the game, and therefore that's where we chose very specifically to stop trying to replicate cooperative businesses, take what we've developed in Philadelphia and New York, deepen that, so now we're quite sizable as companies, but leverage that by investing in public policy change and advocacy change. So we've done a lot of work to improve reimbursements, to improve training standards and public policy. Just at the federal level, just 3 weeks ago, after a 5-year struggle, we've been working daily with the U.S. Department of Labor to change the fact that, you may not know this, but home care workers in the United States are not protected by minimum wage and overtime protection. They're carved out as an exception, as what they call the babysitter exemption, as if these jobs were only to require the skills of a babysitter. So we worked very hard to change the Department of Labor's regulations of Fair Labor Standards Act to include home care workers, and finally, after a 5-year struggle, the Department of Labor announced the final rule change 3 weeks ago, and that impacts 2 million. And I hasten to add, we're not, PHI was very much in the lead of that, but very many other organizations, National Employment Law Project, SEIU, Union, many other folks were in this battle together. But you don't get too many national victories of late, and so we'll take it. And that impacts 2 million workers. And I think that what the story of that is, although it's a many years story, is that by being inside the industry, by being an actor inside the industry, we have enormous knowledge, enormous credibility, relationships that allowed us to become an actor within the sector and within the industry. So that's the type of leverage that is absolutely, I think, necessary if this is a strategy that's supported by public and philanthropic dollars. That's enterprise development alone is insufficient given what we know to be the scale of the problem.
And so Camille, ESOPs also have had their struggles. What are the beefs you usually hear with that model, and how do you answer them? And
Well, one of the main things I think is a misconception is that if you put in employee ownership, or if you give people stock, or if you create this plan, that magically changes the entire company, and it's not true. Creating employee ownership itself, having a stake in the financial success of the company, is only one. It's an important but one element of an ownership culture, which is what you need to have a successful company that grows and is profitable. And I think that in the examples that we've seen that are difficult, and there's some very high profile examples of United Airlines, for example, or the Chicago Tribune. It's what a lot of people in the United States associate with the employee stock ownership plan. And there's a negative perception because of that, because both of those companies went into bankruptcy after having an employee stock ownership plan. It was not because of the employee stock ownership plan, it was because those companies were headed for bankruptcy, and they didn't fully, and employee ownership can be a tool to improve performance, to get a company back on its feet. It can't resurrect a company that's, one, not committed to employee ownership or creating an ownership culture, and it can't resurrect a company that wasn't going to be resurrected either. So those are, it was newspaper industry and airlines. Those are very difficult industries to be successful in these days. So there's a lot of negative perception there. But what's important is that when you do engage employees, when you do create an employee ownership culture, along with having a real financially meaningful ownership stake, you create better companies and better jobs, and the statistics are overwhelming. For employees, it's 2.5 times the retirement assets, and so think about that in terms of a 400,000. These are going to vary depending on who your workforce is, but 400,000 versus $1 million when you retire after however many years, that's a significant difference, because often ESOPs are on top of a diversified plan or a pension plan or some other type of plan. It's also higher compensation, 5 to 12% higher overall compensation at employee-owned companies, and they're 4 times less likely to be laid off. And for the companies, it's a very compelling way to drive performance. They're 25% less likely to close. Over the first year that the ESOP is implemented, if they develop this culture, it's between 2 to 5% higher productivity, sales. The return on that investment is really high. So employee ownership can be a great driver to help employees at all levels increase their wealth. And one story, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's a 50-minute documentary on employee ownership called We the Owners, Employees Expanding the American Dream. And one of the stories that gets me teary-eyed pretty much every time I watch it is this guy, and he's a forklift driver. And he talks about this time, and he didn't go to college. He had very limited education. Hasn't gone beyond forklift driving at New Belgium Brewing, an employee-owned company out of Fort Collins, which also happens to be a B Corp. And he says, he talks about this time when he went to go and buy a house. It's, assets, something that so many people never get to do anymore. Buying a house is such a difficult thing to do. And he went and did it without a broker, without a real estate broker. And because of the financial participation that he learned, the open book management, what it meant to be an owner at New Belgium Brewing, he was able to do that transaction by himself, a $500,000 transaction where he bought a house. And he would have never, one, been able to purchase that house, or two, been able to understand those really difficult concepts. And he said, you know, on the other side of the table from me was a bunch of suits, and they were like, who is that guy? And why can he sign these papers on his own? Why can he do that, you know? And it's such a compelling story because it talks to all the different aspects of where our society is failing people, you know? It's like, not only does he have a job where he makes a wage, not only is he building assets, but he's able to do it and feel like he can control these things because he has the training and financial knowledge to be in control of his financial world. So I think that while there's a lot of bad press around ESOPs, and the bottom line is they're a tool. They're a mechanism for sharing employee ownership broadly, and they're a very successful mechanism for sharing employee ownership broadly. But like any mechanism, it can be abused. There's huge tax benefits that come with employee ownership. You can abuse those. There are federal laws that try to catch you, but I mean, you know, the government's closed down, so they might not in the next however long. So there's people who do it for the wrong reasons. There's going to be all of these things that make ESOPs look bad in certain lights, but it's a tool for sharing ownership. Mm-hmm. And in no other country do you have this accessible level of a tool to be like, oh, if I want to sell my company, if I want to leave this company intact with the people who helped me build it, I have this preset format to do that. And that's what an ESOP is. So it's difficult because I do absolutely agree that there are problems with how it's being implemented. There's a lot of employee-owned companies we never see or touch, and we don't know what they're doing. But we think this tool is very important and that it's been very successful.
Interesting. It's a really compelling story. So this is slightly tangential before we sort of wrap up. I kind of, something that's in the back of my mind right now is how worker ownership and sort of, as we're talking about building good jobs and worker empowerment, how does it relate to sort of the labor movement and unions? I mean, because that is also a way of trying to build labor power and create some degree of control over your workplace. Are these just industries where unions have failed, or are worker ownership models more important because the labor movement is sort of in retreat? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? If not, it's okay.
So the labor movement is very important in terms of the low-wage workforce, and Cooperative Home Care said we figured that having a 2,000 worker employee-owned company wasn't complex enough, so we are unionized as well. So, so in New York, SEIU, which is the largest healthcare union in the country and one of the more powerful ones, it has a great deal of saturation within New York City particularly. They organize much of the home care industry, almost all the hospitals and nursing homes. So they're an enormously politically powerful entity. And we had always worked with them on public policy issues, basically fighting on the same side. They hadn't organized our part of the industry up until about 7 or 8 years ago. But when they did, we welcomed them with management neutrality, and we've been organized for about 7 years or so. So they have been very, very supportive overall of our work, both as an employee-centered company, but also in our public policy work. There's a number of unions that are beginning to toy, basically, or beginning to explore worker ownership as a strategy. The steel workers have in the past and are revisiting that strategy. SEIU is looking at it more broadly. So I think the labor movement is definitely trying to reconsider all different options of how they can still drive support for their members, and this is one area that they're looking at.
So are your workers both the employers and the employees? Are their management and their
Well, I mean,
workers?
I told you it wasn't simple. Right? So they are owners, and they are workers and employees. So it's a conventional for-profit corporation in the sense that we have a board of directors that hires and fires management, directs management. It's just that the corporate board is elected by the workers, and the majority of our corporate board, which is about a $60 million company, is our home health aides.
so they can go out on strike against themselves, basically. So,
It could, well, and there's, it's, there have been stories of that, not in our case, but in the labor movement in the past where there have been, in part because of the complexity of the employee stock ownership plan, and that there's a trust mechanism that sort of often sits between the workers and the company. There have been cases where literally workers have gone out and strike against the ESOP.
It's a pretty difficult, it's a complicated issue when it comes to employee stock ownership plans, because there are wonderful cases of employee-owned companies and unions working together, buying out the company together, working together to buy. Marlin Mold, I think, is an example of the workers and the union and the management of the company coming together to be like, we're going to close our doors if we don't do something. Let's buy the company and let's make this work together. There's also a number of examples of unionized ESOPs. Homeland Grocery is a large example. There's also a lot of grocery stores that don't, say the ESOP is in place of needing a union because employees are actually the owners. So there's talk on either side of that debate, and it's a complicated issue. Where they do work together, it's incredibly powerful. But there are companies that empower workers, that give them such good benefits at ESOPs, that what they've got at those companies, is probably better than many union benefits or many negotiated benefits. So, I mean, it's a full, however long this discussion is, and probably longer, talk about that relationship, but certainly they both have their place and they can work together. So that's where we end up on ESOPs and labor unions.
Got it.
could I just add something to this? Because, I mean, it's a fascinating question that you guys are talking about here, and it's important because the labor movement is obviously up against the ropes, and there's a decision, a case before the Supreme Court this term, which really is a dagger pointed at the heart of the labor movement, called the Mulhall case, which basically would forbid neutrality agreements as an improper bribe or gratuity to the union. And so the labor movement obviously needs to be in a mode of thinking of creative ways to deal with the assault on organizing rights and NLRA rights in the courts. And so this might be one I never thought, until you started talking, Camille, about ESOPs as being kind of a form of material concession to the workers, that you could, Section 7 of the Wagner Act gives people the right to engage in concerted action, not just to organize a union, but you could have a strike for ESOP rights. You could organize to push something like that too. So.
It'd be great. All sorts of ideas. Oh my goodness. So, last question before we get to your guys' questions, because you probably got better ones than me. Steve talked about how it's like some of the public policy tools that help worker-owned cooperatives or other forms of worker ownership companies are just public policy tools that would help any company, right? It's like you need to have a successful business before you can have a successful co-op. But are there things that could change to ease the way forward for these models, state, national, federally, or approaches that could be more or less helpful from the sort of philanthropic nonprofit community? And have we seen good stuff from that community, and could they be helping more? Just Twitter wants to question that.
I can start?
Sure.
When we started doing cooperative development about 35 years ago, there was very little experience in the United States. I mean, there used to be, people used to point back to the Knights of Labor in the 19th century or something as the last time there was a real worker cooperative movement in the country. So we had very few people to learn from, quite frankly. We were really stumbling on our own. That's not true anymore. There's now 35 years of experience. There's not a whole lot of worker-owned companies, but there are 300. There are several that are very successful, very stable, very profitable, very employee-oriented. So, you know, what I see happening is a resurgence of interest in the worker cooperative form, which is great. We really want to encourage. But it's bad enough to reinvent the wheel. Instead, people are reinventing the flat tire. You know, they're just going in there and doing the same stuff, the same mistakes that we made 30 years ago, and you just don't have to do that because now there are resources. There's a U.S. Federation for Worker Cooperatives. That's basically the trade association of worker-owned companies. There's the ICA group, which for years has provided technical assistance to worker-owned companies. Hillary Abell is just about to publish a paper. She used to work for Wages, which Camila is on the board of, which is a cooperative network in California that's done sort of a lessons learned of worker cooperative development that will be published by the Democracy Collaborative in the next couple of weeks. So there's just a lot of information and knowledge now available to people, and I'm not sure that the field is taking good advantage of that. So it's a shame if there are resources going in to initiatives without taking benefit of the fact that there's now people who actually have been through it a couple of times and know what they're doing. I think in terms of public policy, it's always, everyone is always looking for ways in which to answer the fundamental problem of at least low-income cooperative development, which is a lack of capital, lack of equity, particularly. There's several sources of debt capital. That is good, but doesn't replace equity. And so there's been just a constant search. In fact, the Colors restaurant in New York City, which was created by the workers who were survived the attack on the Windows of the World during September 11th, they formed a worker cooperative restaurant, and they had lots of different debt sources. They had to go to their friends in Italy to get from the Italian cooperative movement to get an equity investment in the cooperative. So there's just no source of thoughtful venture capital for the worker ownership model. And so there's often efforts to create public sources of that, and usually it all ends up either going nowhere or ending up being another form of debt, which is nice but not the same. So there's this fundamental question of how do you scrape together some real risk capital as was successfully done in terms of a model for the community development finance corporations in this country. There's a significant, billion-dollar program basically that's put equity dollars into the community development system, and that's what we would need. It's comparable.
Most low-wage workers are in C or S corporations or traditional corporations, and in order to move low-wage workers up the ladder in corporations, it has to be in the corporation's interest. It's got to make the corporation's bottom line more successful. And I think the one public policy that would really help is an incentive for training. Right now, the way training is held in most companies, it has to be expensed immediately when done. And that expensing immediately when done is hard to budget against. Versus when you go buy a machine, you can treat it a totally different way. So you see CapEx being 9x for every X of training. And so there are some states, we're in Louisiana, and Louisiana has a specific training incentive, state small, that targets manufacturing or oil and gas, that allows for us to go do that and recoup some of those efforts. And in Detroit, we have nothing, so we do less. Right? So the fact of the matter is, I think training and trust takes workers up a ladder, right? And once they know what they're doing and they do it over time, you trust that they can do it, and then you give them more because they're giving you more. And right now, the way we deal with training in this country could be helped with policy.
All right, okay. So, you guys have been saving up your questions. Ready? Okay, ma'am. Yes.
My name is Li Yang. Thanks for panelists to discuss this wide range in different form of employment or job creation. But we got to focus on who create a good job. So whether the old traditional or new form is really just job itself, whether you're self-employed or family-based or home-based or corporation. The problem is now, I think you have mentioned the capital, but I think it's more important. It's not just human capital, your skill and talents and your training, but also your family relationship, your people can work for you, and people you can trust, and then you can sort of expand your businesses. So the problem now, what we have is those resources will be depleted, whether your financial assets have been taken away by financial institution or your assets, your reputation have been damaged. And there's no way that you can ask the government to clean this up. Actually, the so-called job increase is basically a propaganda to subsidize or bail out, for instance, financial institution or bail out General Motors.
Can you like sort of encapsulate in the
Right.
question?
So what I try to say is that currently, all those resources that we need for good job or good cooperation or employment is sort of non-existent, and people cannot complain. And actually,
Okay.
all our phone.
I'm not sure if I'm drawing out a question.
Can I take a- I
my
can take a
question
shot
is
at it.
all the approach, all the asset you need, all communication or phone or email, computer will be blocked.
Okay,
So what
Jamie
we want
has
to
his
address
response.
this
I've got
issue.
a response.
great.
So but I like very much the point that, even if we can improve wages, either through worker ownership or, enterprises like yours, low-wage workers are still subject to a lot of predatory practices in the real estate industry, in the banking industry, and it's very expensive to be poor in America. So I take from that point the idea that one way that you help lift people out of poverty and get them into secure employment is to reduce the amount of the predatory practices that people are subject to as consumers, as renters, as tenants, and so on. And I think that's absolutely right.
You?
So the consumer cooperative bank was started in the early 80s, late 70s, and I'm just wondering what you think about the consumer cooperative bank. Has it been useful? And how could it be more useful to the movement? The national.
Yes, right, National Cooperative Bank. That's a long,
Complex feeling.
they have been helpful to us specifically. I mean, they've financed several of the healthcare cooperatives that we've been associated with. They've actually financed PHI. There's also, it's a little complicated because there's both the bank and the development corporation that they created that does more risk-taking than the bank itself. I think the cooperative bank got caught like all the other banks in the 2008 problems, so they're still recovering from that. I think it was still a example where a fair amount of resources were invested in that initiative. It still came out relatively too risk averse, and since they were a bank, they definitely had to get their money back. But I think I would like to. It did not fill the gap of a true risk capital source for cooperative development. They've been very helpful, but it didn't answer the need for an equity source as, again, the Community Development Finance Institutes have.
Yes, ma'am, back up.
I work with independent businesses to help them transition to employee ownership, and so I would love to hear from a couple of you about some of the general steps and challenges you see as an existing corporation considers transitioning to employee ownership, and then in particular, challenges for transitioning to a worker cooperative versus seeing an ESOP as a default model if you're not already structured as a cooperative.
Yeah, well, it's one of the major ways that we're trying to see more employee ownership, but is through ownership transitions. Right now we're seeing a they're calling it the tsunami of baby boomer transitions, where there's a lot of people who are retiring, who are business owners, and an employee stock ownership plan might be a good fit for a lot of those companies. So we're hoping to see, I think awareness is not scalability with the co-op model. Awareness is one of our major issues in the ESOP world. But there are difficulties in transition. Well, any kind of ownership transition is difficult. ESOPs are very technical and have a lot of, they're governed by federal law, and because of the incredible tax benefits, there's also incredible rules that you have to follow. And I think there's so many competent service providers and practitioners out there that can help that. And that's what we're here for too, is to do initial feasibility, to work with any company that's interested, to talk them through whether it would be a good fit. And it's just basically the process. It's an individual company process, them calling us or calling somebody that knows about employee ownership in a meaningful way. There's a lot of people who say they understand employee ownership that don't. So that's a difficulty, finding practitioners that actually understand the topic and seeing if it's a good fit. It's for brokers who are trying to sell. They often don't want to talk about employee ownership. You don't get a commission when you sell to the people who are in your building. So that's a difficulty too. You don't hear the right information. So I think one of the major problems is just access to reliable information about what employee ownership is and how it can be a tool and whether it's a good fit for your company. Because for a lot of companies, like ones that aren't profitable, it's not necessarily a very good fit. So so that's where we are. I think it's, yeah.
Let me add, because I've actually gone through and done an ESOP. One thing that Camille said, you got to be making money. You've got to, right? EBITDA is very important when doing an ESOP valuation, because you're going to get a haircut because you're going to do an ESOP. So the other thing is advisory costs are very high. It's complicated. So it's not complicated in concept, but there's a lot of rules. So you're going to need tax people, you're going to need ESOP advisors, you're going to need, so the ancillary cost of doing a deal is high. The other thing is, if you're going to do 100% ESOP, quality of management is very, very important. If you've got a younger management team, it's going to be more difficult to transact an ESOP than if you've got a seasoned team that absolutely understands the business if the equity changes and they can keep running. So those are the three things: strength of management, advisory cost, and EBITDA, I would say you have to concern yourself with.
Sorry.
Yes. When I hear of a worker cooperative, I think of low wages. So can you give me an example? Okay. All right. It's for the TV. Yes. So when I hear of worker cooperatives, I think of low wages. So can you give us an example of like what the typical yearly salary for the employee owners in your organization and yours as well?
So in cooperative home care, the average wages will be, as of March of next year, the minimum wage will be $10 an hour plus $4 in benefits. And it's very important to ask, though, wages is one thing, but number of hours worked is also really important when it's take home. So in our industry, workers tend to be a part-time industry, so 20 to 25 hours is the norm. In our cooperative, it's 36 hours is the average employment. So so that is still too low, absolutely, and that's why we work so hard on the public policy side, because that's what really sets those wages. And if you asked me that question 2 years ago, the answer would have been $8 an hour, and in our company's benefits, but in the industry, mostly no benefits unless you're unionized. So we led a New York State policy initiative to create essentially a minimum wage for any Medicaid-funded home care workforce in the city, and that's what's raised the wages 25%. So that's an example, again, of if you're just going to try to do everything from just the enterprise, that's not enough. You've got to really leverage your knowledge and your relationships and your expertise to try to create change broader within the sector. There are other, and I think you're right that there's the reputation for a lot of worker co-ops are in low-wage industries precisely because low-wage companies tend to not need a lot of capital to get started, relatively speaking. but there are other examples of other companies that are successful worker-owned companies that do pay middle-class wages. Equal Exchange is another fair trade coffee company that's in Massachusetts that employs about 125 people, highly salaried. So there's a range, but we come at it from a development perspective from low-income people who have low-wage jobs. So our purpose is to figure out how not only to create career ladders, which is really important, but also how to raise the floor for these jobs. How do you improve bad jobs or poor quality jobs through better training, better wages, better benefits, better supervision, better access to public resources, and a culture of support. That's what we try to do.
And now, did you want to? Okay. Okay. More questions. Okay.
I probably don't need this, but forgive me if I sit down. I've got a bad wheel here. I find myself in an interesting position as a startup looking to start an ESOP because I've been a member of the Center for Economic and Social Justice for years. And capitalization is a major issue for a startup. The startup as an ESOP is virtually an impossibility. I almost did it in Kentucky with free money from the city and the state, but that finally evaporated for political reasons. So here's the question. How can we make, and I think the question was asked earlier, how can we make capital available for companies that want to do the thing that's going to allow people to be owners? How do we expand the middle class? The only way we're going to expand the middle class is by giving people property, because you don't get into the middle class easily on wages, especially today. So the question is how to do that, how to make capital available. One of the issues that Dr. Kurland has advocated, and I want to make sure that everybody knows who Norm Kurland is, he actually was a member of the team that drafted the ESOP legislation and was a partner of Louis Kelso. How could we make money available? And our argument is there should be credit insurance, so that loans like that can be handled in an expeditious fashion that doesn't unfairly burden any financial institution, but allows, as a matter of public policy, resources to be available to encourage more employee-owned, more cooperatives. In fact, right now, one of the biggest arguments for the ESOP is that the cooperative doesn't have a built-in funding mechanism, where the ESOP does. And the ESOP, as been stated earlier, the ESOP has tremendous tax advantages. An employee could have $10 million in ESOP money in his own shop, and he doesn't pay, or she doesn't pay a dime until that money's taken out, just like a 401k.
So we've got our question.
Yeah, the question is, where do we find,
Right.
how do we find more capital for startup companies that would be ESOPs if they could?
I mean, it's a difficult issue. Loan guarantee programs would be wonderful, I think it's hard. For us, we see a lot that for companies that have heard about employee ownership, that capital can be a very difficult issue. And there's some states that have, like Indiana has a program to help finance employee ownership, and the SBA has small loans for that are very difficult to use, that are grunt-worthy. But I feel like there is a gap. There are some companies. Chris Mack, and he's a leader in the employee ownership field, and he is a partner or special advisor for a firm that's doing ESOP lending. And I attended SOCAP. I don't know if you've heard of that conference recently, but there's a lot of money that's being thrown towards social entrepreneurs and social enterprises and all of that. We spoke there because I think that's a great community for building, first getting some capital into businesses that believe in employee ownership from the beginning. But traditionally in our sector, we've mostly seen it be traditional businesses, conventional businesses that then want a transition option. So it hasn't been as much. But with this budding idea of social entrepreneurs wanting to be employee owned, I think that's a great place for us to start and for us to talk.
Follow on, if I may. One of the things that we've been forced to do is to go to a C Corp and go to a private equity offering, and then then our plan is to use the ESOP to buy out the minority stockholders, so that we can convert to an ESOP at a later date. But to get into an ESOP flat-footed, virtually impossible.
Mr. Curlin.
Yeah, I think Kelso was more than a guy dealing with specific firms and how you finance specific firms. He was talking about the system as a whole. And there, if you solve the problem of where the money comes from, and I agree with what Jerry said, you also need a substitute for collateral if you're starting from scratch. And that is insurance, because the reason for collateral is to cover the risk of default. But Kelso went much bigger, because he was really talking about how you change the system to really democratize ownership as a basic, fundamental human right, and lifting the barriers in the macro system. And the most important one is available under existing law, and I think it could bring together different parts of the ownership movement. And that is Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act. Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act was there from the very beginning. And what it did was say that it talked about if there isn't sufficient savings in any of the 12 regions for agriculture, industry, and commerce, each of the regional banks could discount what's called bills of exchange, okay? That's precisely what you do when you start a business. You're going into a bank, and a bill of exchange talks about how you're going to get a loan, but how you're going to pay for it. So you have to put up your plan. And so one day, the ownership movement is going to wake up to the existence of Section 13 and begin demanding it. And I hope the labor movement recognizes, because it's really in bad shape today, that it wakes up and people begin to organize at the Federal Reserve, demanding that the new head, the new chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, begin to activate Section 13 of the Federal Reserve as a source of new money that doesn't depend on old money, accumulated wealth of the rich, but rather it's credit, and this is the key to Kelso's idea, credit repayable with future savings. And to that extent, anybody with a sound business plan should be able to put together a package. Commercial banks are supposed to be in the business of financing sound businesses, and that is the key. And I think everybody in this room ought to take a look at Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act.
Well, now.
Good reading. All right. Any last burning questions? I got time for one more.
And it can be interest-free.
It's that easy, my goodness. I feel like a terrible person for having to choose between you guys. You had your hand up the longest.
Thank you. My question is regarding B Corps. Given, in my understanding of B Corps is a relatively new structure. Currently, my understanding is also these B Corps tend to be relatively smaller businesses. Is there anything in their structure that you think would prohibit them from being larger, global, scalable organizations, maybe to the likes of a GE at some point in their time, or is there something in their structure that would prohibit that type of growth and scalability?
It's interesting, some of the support for benefit corporations came from progressive hip businesses that became targets for takeover, like Ben & Jerry's. Essentially, they felt as if they were going to be vulnerable to shareholder derivative litigation if they didn't go with the high bidder, as opposed to the bidder who most closely approximated the values of the company. And so, but one of the legal advantages of being a benefit corporation is that the company can act in interests outside of just the bottom line shareholder value. They can say, no, this takeover would-be acquirer is not consistent with the environmental values of the company, or is going to get rid of an important social project that we're engaged in, or what have you. But I would think that as benefit corporations begin to grow and spread across the country, more people find out about them. People want to spend their money with benefit corporations. People want to work at benefit corporations. People want to invest in benefit corporations, and it merges with different forms of worker-controlled enterprise, you could get kind of rival versions of what big corporations should be doing.
And
I foresee that will happen over time.
So one of the aspects of the benefit corporation is a slightly different structure, that there is a fiduciary duty to at least try to have a beneficial impact on society. That's not something you can impose on public shareholders after the fact. But there are a number of benefit corporations, and it's a little complicated because there's certified B Corps, which is like a fair trade type certification thing. And then there's things like in Maryland where there's an actual legal structure where you still say an S or a C Corp, but you're also a B Corp, and there's these additional fiduciary duties that come with it, and there's this additional structure, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility. It's like you said, to sell to whom you want. But if you're starting as a private company and you want to become a public company, and your shareholders know from the beginning that those types of restrictions, that if they were going to have a sale or the way that they're running their business is different, then those shareholders know going into it. So I don't know if they've experienced it yet. I think they're close to experiencing a public company, or they just have. It's very recent. I know that there's been one acquired. I don't know the name of the subsidiary, but Campbell's acquired a company, and the fact that they were a benefit corporation changed the level, their negotiations in the sale. And so that's a wholly owned subsidiary by Campbell that's now being run with benefit corporation values. So it is a scalable concept, and those different shareholder values, it has to grow from the ground up, but it can't be imposed on a larger company from the beginning. But there's potential for all of these to grow and scale and be larger. So I think it's a great structure. And we have King Arthur Flour, Dansko, New Belgium Brewing, Full Sail Brew. I like breweries. There's a lot of overlap between B Corp and ESOPs, and I think that as they grow, we'll see some public companies that you'll be able to invest in that are triple bottom line companies. So I think that's.
All right. Thank you all. Such a fascinating conversation. I hope you guys will have time to hang out and answer other questions that you have.
Yes, thank you. So we are at time, but I want to give our panelists a round of applause. I think they've been fabulous. Thank you all. I'm glad you all now have great beer recommendations. And I hope you